They stuffed my life into trash bags, like I was nothing, but forgot I was on the deed. They thought I'd disappear quietly. Instead, I listed the house under their feet. This is how I turned their eviction into their eviction notice. What happened next will shock you. But before we continue, hit that subscribe button for more stories like this. I knew something was wrong the moment I stepped onto the porch. The lights were off, the door slightly ajar, like it was afraid of what lived behind it. The silence inside wasn't just still, it was staged. And there, lined up like garbage day came early, were 6 black trash bags slumped by the entryway. My things, my life. Stuffed in plastic and tied at the top like leftovers nobody wanted. Clothes I had folded with care now crushed and wrinkled. A photo of my mother cracked diagonally through the middle, her smile split open like a wound. Journals I'd written in since college flung in with shoes, torn and damp at the edges like someone had spilled something and decided it didn't matter. There was no note, no text, no face to meet mine at the door. Just the cold precision of someone who had made a decision in private and executed it with the ruthlessness of a landlord evicting a stranger. I stood there for a full minute, maybe more, unable to touch the bags. Like if I reached for them, it would confirm that I had, in fact, been discarded. My chest didn't burn. It sank, like someone had filled it with wet concrete. I walked around the house in a daze, half expecting it to be a joke, a misunderstanding, anything other than what it so clearly was, a dismissal. My cousin's voice, once so saccharine when she needed something, now gone. Her children, whom I had helped raise like my own, nowhere to be found. The air smelled like lavender spray and cowardice. I went back outside and sat next to my things, not because I didn't know where to go, but because I needed to feel every ounce of what they'd done. Sometimes, pain deserves to be held, not rushed. And so I stayed there, knees pulled to my chest, surrounded by the pieces of a life I thought had value. They hadn't just thrown me out. They'd erased me. Like I was an extra chapter in their story they could skip with one harsh edit. But what they didn't know, and what they would come to learn, is that not everything in a trash bag is trash. Some things come with receipts. Some things come with rights. And this time, the one thing they threw out was the one person holding the deed. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I just picked up my bags and walked away, quietly. Which is how all storms begin. They always called me family, with that syrupy tone people use when they want loyalty without obligation, when they want devotion without debt. I was the cousin who moved in after the funeral, the one they said could stay as long as you need. But over time, the warmth in those words curdled into something colder, something tight and begrudging. The guest room they offered me with wide smiles and open arms slowly turned into a storage closet with a bed. Laundry baskets piled in corners, seasonal decorations stacked against the wall, mismatched hangers clinking in the closet like reminders that I didn't belong. It smelled faintly of cedar and something old, like the kind of room no one wants to spend more than a night in. I'd lie awake some nights and stare at the ceiling, hearing their laughter downstairs, the inside jokes I was never quite part of, the way my name never quite landed right in their mouths. I made their meals, filled their fridge, helped with homework, held their baby when she had colic and rocked her through the hours they didn't want to spend. I washed dishes without being asked, mended clothes without being thanked, and kept the house running while they played host to a world that only knew the polished version of them. But I was never quite allowed into the picture. Not really. At holidays, I was always the one taking the photo, not in it. At family dinners, I served the food and cleared the plates while they scrolled their phones and talked about vacations I wasn't invited to. I learned to be useful, because usefulness is the currency of the unwanted, and the moment you stop being useful, you become weight. They said I could make myself at home, but everything in that house belonged to someone else. Every couch cushion fluffed with judgment, every shelf curated without room for my books, every whisper through the walls a reminder that I was tolerated, not cherished. And yet I stayed, because grief will chain you to anything that resembles shelter. I told myself love would come if I earned it hard enough, but love isn't a paycheck, and eventually, even the most patient soul realizes when they're being underpaid in kindness. That room was never mine. It was a waiting room dressed like a bedroom, and when they bagged my life and put it on the curb, I understood. My time as their family had expired. But what they didn't know was that my silence had been collecting interest, and soon the eviction would be theirs. There wasn't a slam of a door, no screaming match or breaking glass, just a silence that began to hum louder than words. It crept in slowly, like frost on a window, subtle and chilling. The day before had been like any other. I'd packed the kids' lunches, folded the laundry, refilled the fridge without being asked. I'd even fixed the loose doorknob on the pantry, something their father had said he'd get to months ago. But the next morning, the coffee was already poured, for 2, not 3, and my usual seat at the kitchen table was quietly occupied by unpaid bills and a laptop. She barely looked at me. He mumbled good morning without eye contact. The children were unusually quiet, like they felt it too, but didn't have the vocabulary for exile. I stood there in the doorway, still wearing the cardigan her youngest spilled juice on just 2 days earlier, waiting for a nod, a smile, some acknowledgement that I still belonged to the shape of their life. But it never came. Breakfast came and went in an awkward haze, punctuated only by the scrape of forks and the clink of dishes I used to wash before they even noticed they were dirty. I went back upstairs to the guest room, my room, though never really mine, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the perfectly folded sheets I'd changed just the day before. And then my phone buzzed. A message from her. Not a conversation, not a face-to-face. Just a text, chirpy in tone and cruel in execution. Hey, we've been thinking it's probably time you figure out your next chapter. You've been great, but we just need some space to grow as a family. I stared at the screen so long the text blurred, not from tears, but from rage masquerading as disbelief. No discussion. No thank you. Just a digital dismissal after years of unpaid labor and emotional scaffolding. I wanted to reply, to remind her of every fever I nursed, every carpool I covered, every night I stayed up when she was out pretending motherhood was optional. But I didn't. I let the silence speak for me. Because the day they decided I was no longer useful wasn't the day I became powerless. It was the day I became unbound. And some people don't realize they're setting you free until you start walking away with everything they thought you'd never claim. They thought they were sending me away with trash bags and pity. But what they didn't realize was that I had been watching them from a higher floor the whole time. They forgot that I wasn't just the cousin who showed up after the funeral, quiet and grieving, needing a place to land. I was the granddaughter our grandmother trusted most, the one who held her hand in hospice, the one who knew where the real documents were kept, not just the ones they paraded around during family dinners. Long before her memory faded, Grandma had called me into her study, frail but fierce, and told me, "They'll try to take this place someday. You make sure they don't." She handed me the notarized deed, updated with my name right beneath hers. She said it wasn't about the house, it was about fairness, about how I had been there, really there, when everyone else was too busy, or too selfish, or too late. And so she put my name in ink while theirs stayed in assumption. After she passed, they moved me in with performative grace, calling it generosity, calling it what family does, but never once asked what I had or what I knew. They assumed I had nothing because I asked for nothing. They believed kindness meant weakness and humility meant lack. And so they overlooked me in every conversation about the future of the house, dismissing me like a placeholder, a guest who overstayed her welcome. They made decisions without me, remodeled the kitchen with inherited money they assumed was solely theirs, and whispered about selling someday, as if I didn't have a say. But I was there every time the property tax bill came addressed to me, too. I saw the equity statements with both our names. I watched them live off what they believed they owned, never once thinking someone else held the keys in silence. It was a kind of arrogance that only comes from people who've never had to check a balance before making a decision. And I let them believe it, because some truths only become valuable when they're revealed at the right moment. When they shoved my life into garbage bags and pushed me out like a stray, they thought it was over. What they didn't know was that the house they tossed me from wasn't theirs to begin with. Not entirely. And I was done letting them forget. I didn't raise my voice when they closed the door behind me, didn't scream in the driveway or scatter their names across social media like curses. I simply picked up the bags they packed for me and walked away, quiet and composed, because I'd learned a long time ago that silence unsettles the arrogant more than rage ever could. They expected a scene, something messy they could point to later and say, "See? That's why she had to go." But instead, I gave them nothing. No closure, no confrontation, just absence. And while they celebrated their clean break and rearranged the furniture like I'd never existed, I started making phone calls. Not to friends, not to family, but to people who kept records and remembered names. The estate lawyer who handled Grandma's affairs still had me in her contacts and greeted me like an old friend. The real estate agent who helped Grandma refinance before her stroke still remembered me as the girl who brought her tea during meetings. And the tax clerk down at the county office? He pulled my name from the records before I even finished explaining why I called. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "You're still listed as co-owner." I thanked him, wrote everything down, and began building a case not from anger, but from fact. Because you don't need to shout when the documents whisper louder than any accusation. I compiled emails, mortgage statements, repair receipts with both our names in faded ink. I even had voice memos from Grandma, nothing legal but deeply personal, where she explained, in her own careful cadence, why she added me to the deed. "I trust you," she said once. "You won't let them ruin what's meant to be shared." And now, as they redecorated the house like a kingdom finally free of a tenant they never truly welcomed, they had no idea that the walls still bore my name. Silence, when wielded correctly, is sharper than any weapon. And I let mine grow into conversations, into contracts, into leverage. I didn't need to threaten or cry. I just needed to wait until the foundation they stood on remembered who else had poured the concrete. They assumed I was gone, defeated, irrelevant. But I wasn't. I was precise. I was strategic. I was quiet. And that, more than anything, made me dangerous, because people rarely look behind them when they think they've won. They'd always rolled their eyes when I talked about saving money, always made jokes about my budget lifestyle as they clicked checkout on shopping carts full of things they'd forget they ordered. I was the broke one, the frugal cousin with second-hand jeans and a habit of reusing gift bags, the one who didn't dream big the way they did, who wasn't climbing ladders or flashing titles or paying for friendships with wine and brunches. But Grandma saw through it. She saw how I stayed when others left, how I learned to stretch kindness like a paycheck, how I sat beside her even when the days blurred and she couldn't remember what year it was. She never said much about it, but she didn't have to. Her trust wasn't loud, it was legal. Quietly, beneath their noses, she'd updated her will and revised the deed, scribbling my name into the future of a house they thought they'd inherit cleanly, not as charity, as protection. "You don't always need to fight to win," she told me once, her hand trembling over mine. "But you do need to be able to prove the fight was never fair." When she passed, they swept in with casseroles and tape measures, planning renovations before the soil on her grave had settled. I didn't interrupt. I let them paint the walls, change the curtains, throw out the rocking chair she loved. I let them pretend they were building something from the ashes of someone they barely visited, but I kept the papers. I kept the notarized signatures, the updated deed, the clauses that outlined equal ownership. And now, when the truth was needed most, it emerged. Not in my voice, but in hers. Grandma had the last word. From beyond the veil, her decisions sliced through their entitlement like a hot knife through marble countertops. I imagined their faces when they read the copy my lawyer sent, the shock, the disbelief, the panic. Not because I'd taken something from them, but because they'd never truly had it to begin with. They thought her love was measured in holidays and family photos. But Grandma loved in documents, in safeguards, in ensuring that the one who was overlooked would never be erased. And now her signature was my sword, her foresight, my armor. The broke one, they used to call me. But paper speaks louder than pride. And now, I was the one holding the keys to the house they tried to lock behind me. The receptionist offered me a polite smile, probably mistaking me for someone looking to rent a studio or inquire about a part-time admin job. But when I laid the deed on the counter, crisp and signed, with my name inked right next to the property they thought I'd been evicted from, she straightened, like someone suddenly aware they were in the presence of a different kind of woman. The agent came out moments later, tall, sleek, the kind of man who dealt with divorces and death estates without blinking. I held out the folder and said simply, "I want to sell. Cash offers only." He didn't ask why, didn't question if I had permission, didn't tilt his head with suspicion the way people do when someone who looks quiet walks in carrying a weapon of truth. He flipped through the documents, page by page, nodding slowly. "You own 50%, he confirmed, tapping a line with his pen. "And by law, that's enough to initiate a sale." I nodded once, no need to explain the rest. He didn't blink, and neither did I. He asked the questions that mattered: property condition, renovations, any liens or pending issues, but never once asked about the people currently living in it. He knew the type. Families that assumed money meant power, who lived beyond their means in homes they thought were locked down tight, blind to the fine print. I told him everything he needed: square footage, updates I'd overseen, details they hadn't bothered recording because they believed I was the help, not the historian. We scheduled the photographer for the next week. I requested no sign on the lawn, just private showings and a fast turnaround. "This will move quick," he said. "That neighborhood's hot." I smiled at the irony. How something built from cold shoulders and petty cruelty could now burn so fast. As I left the office, the sun hit my face like an omen. I didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. Just steady. Grounded. Like a tree that's been chopped at for years and finally realizes it's still rooted deeper than anyone knew. They thought they'd thrown me out, but all they did was open the door wide enough for me to walk through it with paperwork instead of pain. And now, with a seasoned agent and a boiling market, The house they hoarded pride in was about to become someone else's clean slate. And I, the invisible tenant, had become the one rewriting the contract. They pulled into the driveway like it was any other Tuesday, probably still riding the high of their own importance, maybe even bickering over dinner plans or what show to binge next, until they saw the unfamiliar cars lined up along the curb, sleek and polished, with license plates from the next town over. At first, I imagine they assumed it was a mistake, someone else's party, someone else's emergency. But then the front door swung open, and a woman with a real estate badge waved warmly, clipboard in hand, heels clicking against the hardwood floors I'd once scrubbed on my knees. Inside, a couple wandered through the kitchen like they owned it already, opening the cabinets she'd stuffed with meal kits and expired vitamins, tapping the counters he claimed were imported marble, but were really just laminate with dreams. Another man, mid-30s, confident, stood in the hallway measuring the windows with a laser level, smiling at the dimensions. The kids' toys were still on the carpet, laundry half folded on the armrest, yesterday's coffee growing mold in the sink. Because they didn't know. They weren't warned. Because I didn't owe them that. When the call came through, first his number, then hers, I watched the screen light up, heart thudding not with fear, but with something colder, smoother. Satisfaction. I let it ring, then sent it to voicemail. Because some lessons only sink in through discomfort. Because people who throw out others like rubbish rarely expect to be treated like tenants. I imagined the chaos, her trying to smile as the woman with the clipboard asked if the AC had been serviced, him stammering about ownership while flipping through drawers for documents that no longer protected them. They had built a fortress on assumption, and now strangers were measuring the angles for new walls, new lives. I didn't answer their second call either, or their texts, which grew increasingly panicked. What is this? You can't do this? We need to talk. But there was nothing to talk about. They made their decision the day they packed my life into plastic and tossed it at the door. And now, it was my turn to do some packing of my own, starting with their illusions. The house they once controlled was no longer their kingdom. It was a listing, a commodity, a square footage with potential. And I was the one with the keys, watching from a distance as their world cracked open and finally let the truth shine in. The same family group chat that once buzzed with birthday emojis and half-hearted congrats when someone got a new job suddenly lit up like a 4-alarm fire the moment the house hit the market. I watched it happen in real time. First came the confusion, a screenshot of the listing link with the caption, "Anyone know what this is?" Then the ripple turned tidal. Accusations came sharp and fast, each message layered with thinly veiled judgment and performative concern. Why would she do this to her own family? She's being heartless. There must be some misunderstanding. And then my personal favorite. She's always had a vindictive streak. Funny, I don't recall anyone saying that when my clothes were stuffed into trash bags and dumped by the door like yesterday's leftovers. I don't remember cousins rallying to ask if I had somewhere to go, or if I was okay. No one typed a word when I disappeared quietly from dinners, from game nights, from their photo collages that somehow always cut me off at the edges. But now, oh now, they remembered me. Now I was a villain in a story they hadn't bothered reading until the final chapter. Suddenly, I was the problem. Not the people who made a decision behind my back, not the ones who lived in entitlement and assumed silence meant surrender. I didn't respond to the chat. I didn't defend myself or clarify the legality or link receipts. I let their outrage sit there, stewing in a pot they'd seasoned for years with neglect. let them scroll through their own words and wonder when exactly they'd stopped seeing me as part of the family and started treating me like furniture. One aunt sent a private message saying I should talk things through before doing something so drastic. I considered replying with a photo of the trash bags, but I didn't. Some things don't need to be explained to people who already decided you were disposable. I muted the thread, sipped my tea, and forwarded a message to the agent confirming the next round of showings. Let them scream into the void. Let them assign me all the adjectives they avoided when I was invisible. If reclaiming what I'm legally owed makes me heartless, so be it. I'd rather be cold with a deed in hand than warm in a room where love was conditional. Let them erupt. I'd already erupted quietly. And that silence, it turns out, was far louder. The offers rolled in like waves, firm, full cash, no contingencies, each one stronger than the last. And with every new number, the tension on their end thickened into something almost visible. The house wasn't even on the market for a full week before 3 separate buyers tried to outbid one another, sparking a quiet frenzy the agent said he hadn't seen in months. "It's the layout," he told me. "Families love open concepts, and you've got a clean title that helps too." I smiled at that. A clean title, yes, scrubbed of their assumptions and buffed with quiet patience. What he didn't know was that the real selling point wasn't square footage or curb appeal, it was the irony. This house, the one they used as a throne for their imagined superiority, was now a hot commodity, a prize no longer under their control. Each dollar offered chipped away at their power, turning memories they thought they owned into line items in someone else's contract. They tried to stall, called a lawyer, probably begged one. But co-ownership meant I didn't need permission to list, only cooperation to close. And even that could be bypassed with enough leverage, which I now had in spades. I heard they stopped hosting, cancelled a barbecue, took the welcome sign off the porch. Because how do you smile for neighbours when you don't know which one might soon own your bathroom? Their texts turned from fury to pleading. "Can we talk? Let's find another way. You don't have to do this." But I did. Because for them, this wasn't just about losing a roof. It was about losing the narrative. The perfect family home they bragged about on social media was cracking, its walls echoing with footsteps of strangers touring what they once called theirs. The curated illusion, the Pinterest decor, the filtered holiday photos, the subtle jabs at anyone who hadn't made it, was disintegrating under the pressure of reality. And that pressure was mine to apply. Each new offer was a reminder that the world didn't see me the way they did. It saw value, legitimacy, ownership. With every dollar, their grip loosened, not just on the property, but on the power they wielded so carelessly over someone they never thought would fight back. I didn't need to raise my voice or make a scene. I just needed to let the market speak. And oh, how it spoke, loud, clear, and with interest. They picked a cozy cafe in the nicer part of town, neutral ground, I assume, or maybe just somewhere they thought would soften the conversation. She wore too much perfume, and he had that strained look men get when they've practiced a speech all morning. They greeted me like it was a reunion, like the bags by the door hadn't happened, like we were all adults just trying to clear the air. "We didn't mean it like that," she said, reaching for my hand across the table, the same hand she wouldn't look at when she tossed my life into the driveway. He added something about miscommunication, how tensions were high, how family stuff gets messy. I let them speak. I let them apologize with the vocabulary of people who'd never truly had to own a mistake. Their voices were careful, curated, as if a better tone could undo what their actions had made permanent. When they finished, I smiled. Not cruelly, not smug, just steady. The way you smile when you've outgrown someone's idea of you. I know exactly how you meant it, I said quietly, pulling an envelope from my bag and sliding it across the table. And I meant this. Inside was the final offer letter, full cash, no strings, and far above asking. Their eyes dropped to the figures, and I saw it hit. Not just the number, but the finality. This wasn't a conversation. It was a conclusion. They looked back up, stunned, silent, the way people do when they realize the person they dismissed as background has just delivered the final line. She blinked fast, like she might cry. He leaned back in his chair and let out a breath too shallow to matter. I sipped my coffee. Let them sit with it. Because this wasn't revenge. It was a reckoning. And reckonings aren't loud. They don't need to be. Sometimes they just wear a blazer, bring paperwork and say, "No thank you," to a latte. They asked if I'd reconsider. "We could work something out," he said. "You've made your point," she added. I nodded. "Yes," I said. "And now I'm making my move." I left them at that table, blinking in the sunlight of a truth they thought would stay buried forever. Some apologies come after the credits roll, and by then, the audience has already left the theatre. The closing office smelled like fresh carpet and citrus cleaner, sterile and sharp, the way big decisions often do. The pens were branded, the receptionist cheerful, and the conference room cold enough to make my hands shake, not from nerves, but from the surreal stillness of closure. I sat across from my agent and a notary, flipping through the pages I'd studied a dozen times in silence, each one thick with signatures and commas that meant I had done what they never expected. I followed through. I didn't flinch, didn't stall. I initialed every corner like I was signing the end of a chapter I wrote myself. The check slid across the table, thick with numbers and finality. I tucked it into my folder without looking, because the amount didn't matter. Not really. What mattered was the shift. The irreversible click of a door locking behind me, not because I was thrown out, but because I'd walked out with the deed, the dignity, and the last word. Outside, the new owners, young, wide-eyed, holding hands like a promise, stood waiting with nervous excitement, already planning where to put their furniture and how to repaint the living room. I gave them the keys without ceremony. "She's all yours now," I said, and I meant it. The house was no longer mine to defend or endure. It had been emptied of history and resentment, scrubbed clean of the echoes that once called me an intruder in my own home. I walked the perimeter one last time, slow and quiet, not to mourn it, but to honor the parts of me that had grown up in its shadow. I thought about the nights I cried alone in the guest room, the days I bit my tongue for the sake of peace, and the moment I realized peace was never theirs to give. And then I popped the champagne. Not for spite, not for spectacle, just for me. One glass on the porch steps, warm in the sun, cold on the tongue. I toasted to silence, to legal clarity, to quiet revolutions that start with trash bags and end with bank transfers. I didn't invite anyone. Didn't need witnesses. The bubbles fizzed like applause anyway. I walked away without turning back, because sometimes the cleanest exits are the ones without footsteps. And as I drove off, the rearview mirror showed nothing but a house shrinking in the distance, while I, finally, wasn't shrinking at all. The first time I unlocked the door to my new place, the key stuck for a moment, tight in the lock. Like even the house needed to be sure I was ready to walk into something clean, untouched. It wasn't grand. No double staircase or marble countertops, just a modest bungalow with chipped paint and a front porch that creaked like it had stories to tell. But none of them were mine. That's what made it perfect. There were no ghosts here, no passive-aggressive dinners, no footsteps overhead that carried judgment, no faint scent of perfume left on towels I was never allowed to use. Here, the silence felt like a warm bath instead of a punishment. The rooms didn't shrink when I walked into them. I wasn't a guest, or a placeholder, or a shadow. I was the only name on the mailbox, the only toothbrush in the holder, the only person who got to decide whether the lights stayed on or the door stayed closed. I furnished it slowly. One thrift store lamp, one carefully chosen armchair, one plant that didn't mind being ignored. No rush, no need to impress anyone. I painted the kitchen walls yellow because I could. I left shoes by the door and let dishes pile for a day or two without hearing a lecture. I slept with the window open and didn't worry if anyone heard me breathe. I wasn't performing anymore. I wasn't adjusting my volume or shrinking my dreams to fit someone else's comfort zone. For the first time in years, I didn't flinch when I opened the fridge, afraid of being scolded for touching something not mine. Everything here was mine, even the quiet, especially the quiet. I would sit on the back steps at night, wrapped in an old sweater, watching moths orbit the porch light, and think about how power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums, soft, steady, undeniable. This house didn't have legacy or wealth or polished floors, but it had peace. And peace, I learned, isn't something you stumble into. It's something you earn, piece by piece, after walking through every kind of storm. Here, I didn't have to defend my place at the table. I built the table. I chose who sat beside me. And if no one did, that was fine too. Because this time, the home I entered didn't just have space for me. It was mine, through and through. And no one could take that again. At every birthday, every barbecue I no longer attend, my name floats up like smoke, sharp, unwanted, impossible to ignore. They tell the story the way they need to, as if rehearsing a myth where they're the heroes and I'm the storm that came out of nowhere. In their version, I was the bitter cousin who turned on them without warning, the ungrateful houseguest who took advantage and made everything legal just to prove a point. They leave out the trash bags. They skip the silence. They never mention the years I lived among them like an unpaid intern in my own family, absorbing their needs while shrinking mine. Around fire pits and under string lights, they whisper about how I changed, how I snapped, how I got greedy, like none of it had a cause. I hear the stories third hand, through a friend of a friend, through a cousin who still texts me apologies late at night they'll never say aloud in public. It doesn't sting anymore. It fascinates me. How desperately people cling to their version of things when the truth would demand they face themselves. They don't mention the deed or the will. They don't mention the messages they sent begging me to stop. In their tale, I'm the one who lit the match, not the one who spent years carrying water for a fire they started with entitlement. And that's fine. Let them talk. Let them bend the truth until it's a shape they can sleep beside. I don't need to correct them. Because truth doesn't vanish just because people cover it in noise. It waits. It settles. It outlasts. And I've made peace with being the villain in a story they wrote without me, until I wrote myself back in, with a pen, not a tantrum. Sometimes I picture them sitting in that house for the last time, before the new owners moved in, realizing too late that everything they thought they owned could be sold off with a signature. That's the story I tell myself. Not for revenge, but for balance. They need a version that lets them sleep. I need none of that. I have peace. I have silence. I have the kind of truth that doesn't require an audience. Let them gather and rewrite me as the threat. I'll be too busy living a life they never imagined I could build, one without apology, one without permission, and most of all, one without them. They thought they were discarding a problem when they left my life in bags by the door, like I was something to be taken out before company came. But what they failed to realize, what they were too arrogant, too entitled, too wrapped up in their illusion of control to ever consider, was that I wasn't trash. I was the title holder. I wasn't the guest in that house. I was the co-owner, the one who held legal ground while they floated on assumptions and old hierarchies that no longer protected them. They had the louder voices, the flashier lives, the smug smiles of people who believed kindness was weakness. But I had the document, the one signed by our grandmother, the only matriarch who ever truly saw me. They treated me like background noise until they had to read my name on the listing agreement, on the sales paperwork, on the check that closed out the chapter. They spoke of family while erasing me. And I, in turn, erased their illusion of permanence. What they built on ego, I undid with ink. I didn't scream. I didn't scheme. I simply remembered who I was. And I reminded them, line by notarized line, exactly what that meant. When people ask me now how I found the strength to do it, I tell them it wasn't strength. It was clarity. Clarity that I had spent too long apologizing for my presence, too long making myself small to keep their comfort intact. And the moment they tossed me aside, they made the gravest mistake of all. They reminded me that nothing was truly theirs, not the roof, not the narrative, not the power. I walked away, not with bitterness, but with ownership. Of the house, yes, but more importantly, of myself. I was the one who sold, the one who chose, the one who watched them realize too late that the person they tried to erase was holding the pen the whole time. Let them decorate the past however they need to. Let them bury their shame beneath stories and sideways glances at family functions I'll never attend. I don't need to correct them. My name is carved into history where it counts, in records, in memory, in the deed they thought they owned. They wanted me to feel disposable. But I wasn't what got thrown away. I was what stayed behind, what mattered, what held value. They put me out like garbage. But I was never debris. I was the damn foundation.